We'd like to thank our panel today, and you can go ahead and have a seat and get comfortable. We're so appreciative of you coming today and sharing your time, your thoughts, your history, and blessing us with letting us learn a little bit more about your experiences. My name's Lisa Hagglund. I'm from Heritage Ministries, and we're just so thankful for all of you coming out to our first annual Veterans Day program outside of our facilities. We've been so blessed to partner with the Jackson Center and the Dwyer Association Foundation, who handles the peer-to-peer counseling and the program that really comes alongside the vets and supports them. We have today an amazing panel, and we have our leader of the panel, no pressure on him, to keep everything on track, so that you can learn more about their experiences. We tried to reflect each war or action other than World War I, and we are just so thankful because they each have a different experience. When they came home, they were each welcomed home in a different way. They each had a different transition back into society, and it's important, especially as we grow as a country, and for our different generations, for our children to hear these stories. So we really look forward to growing this event year after year. We're so thankful for our sponsors who came alongside of us, from Catapult Fundraising, Lakeshore Builders, Lakeshore Paving, 360 Graphics, some of our steering committee members who serve on our board at Heritage, just to name a few, who have come alongside of us. There will be a lunch afterwards, so immediately following this event, if you go downstairs, we'll have a free lunch to you, along with our keynote speaker right over there, Rodney Bullard. His list is a little too long to read through, but he is currently the vice president at Chick-fil-A. He is a veteran himself. He's a graduate from Harvard and Duke, and attended as well the Air Force, if I have that correctly. And he's a White House Fellow, which is a very prestigious award, and we're so thankful to have him here. He just wrote a book, Heroes Wanted, and when we go downstairs and transition to our lunch, he's going to be our keynote speaker to talk to us about how we can all be heroes every day in different ways. At Heritage, every year, we serve over 1,200 seniors and have over 800 employees who care for them by living our mission. And as part of that group, each day we're privileged to serve veterans, their spouses, and we get to hear those stories. And we know that it's not enough to just serve them every day, that we have to pass these stories along from generation to generation and make sure our youth understand what they've done for our country. So we're just so thankful. We're thankful to the Jackson Center. We can't say enough about Marion and Cindy, what they've done from Dwyer and Jackson Center. Really, all the legwork goes to them, and to Andrew Hill and Russ Dietrich, who have kind of given us the privilege of coming alongside of us. A lot of people have donated to make this possible. So I'm just going to open the floor up now and invite Greg to come up. Thank you.
Good morning. It's so nice to see everyone, and thank you so much for coming out and being a part of this. There'd be too many people to thank, and I'm sure I'd miss one for putting this event on. So for everyone who had a hand in preparing this event and bringing all of us together, thank you very much. Could we have a quick hand for everybody who's taken part in putting this together? So today is going to be a little bit different because we have a panel of folks here, and they're going to talk about their personal experiences in the service and what they went through, but less from the combat or action side of it, and more what life was like for them as individuals. And most of them being from this area will be able to put some personal touch on it that we can all relate to. So as I ask the questions of the panel, we're going to start with Ms. Garcia at the end, and we're going to work our way across. So the first question I have, or actually the first thing I'd like to do, is have everyone introduce themselves. And with that, I want you to talk a little bit in your introduction about where you were living and what you were doing prior to induction, whether or not you were drafted or you enlisted voluntarily, what branch you joined and why, and do you remember a little something about your earliest days in the service? So Ms. Garcia, if you'll start, that would be great. And if you have any questions as you're going through, that would...
My name is Debra Garcia, and I was in high school when I enlisted, and I was not drafted. I signed up in April, and I left in August, and I was 17, so I had to get permission for my mother to join the service. She had to sign the paperwork for me. And I don't know what else you wanted.
What branch were you in?
Oh, I was in the Air Force. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. And what, now, when you went into the Air Force, did you already have a job picked out, or was it something?
I was an admin. I was a 702 admin.
Great. Okay. Corey?
Hi, my name is Corey Chapman. I'm a 1991 graduate of Maple Grove High School in Bemis Point. I joined during peacetime. It was 1991. There had been a few actions that occurred over the years. Grenada. We attacked Panama. And I, at the time, for whatever reason, when I was born, my mom's actually in the audience. She could tell you I just wore green, which is unique because no one in my family had served since World War II, so I was just born with it in me. So I joined as a junior, just like she said. I was 17. My parents signed off on the paperwork. Junior in high school, and right after that, the Gulf War broke out. As a young person, I was excited because that's what young people do, and but I did miss it. I was assigned to the 3rd United States Ranger Battalion in Fort Benning, Georgia. It was interesting. It was a special operations unit. It was very difficult at the time, especially even in the 90s. They were still laying their hands on you and stuff. And I remember how difficult it was, especially when I first started out. It was very scary. Anyone higher ranked than I was very scared of. But got through it, and it was actually a really good time. Let's see. Then that's pretty much it. That really stays.
Okay, thank you. And how about you, Yuri?
My name is Uriel Isakovich. I volunteered for the draft at 19 years old in 1969. What was I doing? I pretty much had no direction other than I was studying to be a rabbi. I was kind of rebellious, so I left home, volunteered for the draft, and ended up a ranger in the United States Army. My earliest experiences in the Army were much like Corey's. Anybody who was a higher rank than me, I was scared to death of. I had a problem with people who were not Jewish. I was brought up an ultra-Orthodox Jew. I just felt like they didn't understand. I remember my first experience was getting off the bus at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where I took my basic training. They ushered us into the mess hall, where they promptly served us bacon and sausage and ham and eggs. I wasn't hungry. But I made it through, and after leaving the U.S. Army a few years later, I joined the Israeli Army, spent 30 more years in the Israeli Army. But that's another story.
Okay, thank you very much. And Lynn, if you could describe what you were doing when you were inducted into the service and what life was like for you then.
Well, I'm Lynn Watcherson. I was drafted, and when the Korean War broke out, and I was among the first draftees that left Chautauqua County. At that time, we were the first ones. And I took my basic training in Fort Dix, and as soon as I left my basic training, of course we went all through that, and our final test of the basic training and the things they put us through, and they said anybody that fails this will have to take their basic training over again. And so I was bound and determined I wasn't going to fail it. And all the people that failed it had a chance, and they went to Germany or someplace else, and the ones that passed went directly to Korea. So I was one of the ones that went directly to Korea. And at first I left there and went to California. And there from California, we was on a troop ship that went to Japan, and went into Yokohama, Japan, and from there into Korea, and we was on the second invasion of, that's when the Chinese came in and went on the second invasion into Incheon. They didn't have enough American troop ships there, so the group I was in, we went to shore in a Japanese troop carrier, and then of course I went to shore in the little LSD boats. And so that was the beginning of my Korean experience. At that time I was...
Now, being someone who was drafted, did you have any choice what branch of service to go into, or were you just kind of lined up and they said, just point the fingers?
I was trained, I carry a rifleman's MOS, and I still have that MOS, but in Korea, they've looked in my record that I was working as an automobile mechanic and had been through a trade school, and so they put me with the 51st Signal Battalion while I was in, after we landed in Incheon, and we made it up as far as Yeongdeung-po and went back down to Suwon, and at Suwon I joined the 51st Signal Battalion.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Arnone, your turn to introduce yourself and what you were doing at the time you were inducted into the Navy.
Well, my name is Paul Arnone, and I lived in Jamestown all my life. And when the war broke out, I had a notice for the draft, and I decided I wasn't going to be a soldier, so I enlisted in the Navy. And that was in December of 1942. And after I was inducted into the service, I went to service school, and I became a signalman for visual communications. And after graduation from service school, I was assigned aboard a ship, and I became involved in the Normandy invasion, and I landed on Normandy Beach in the second wave on the Gold Beach next to the Omaha Beach. And I spent from the beginning of the invasion till the end of the war in Europe. And we made 27 trips from England to France during all that time, with trips to Le Havre, seacoast city, and Rouen, which was on the Seine River, and Cherbourg, which was the French naval port, the largest naval port they had. And our duties were to provide servicemen with trucks and ammunition and food and medical supplies as they advanced their positions on the beach. And when the war ended in Europe, then I went home for a 30-day leave and went back aboard ship and spent 30 days out at sea, traveled from Norfolk, Virginia, through the Panama Canal out to the Pacific Theater, where we were equipped for the invasion of Japan. And during that time, the Americans were negotiating a treaty with the Japanese, so we were waiting for the go, whether they signed it. If they signed it and made a peace treaty, we were all through with service. If not, we were on our way to Japan. I got the war ended, and it was a treaty, and I was immediately released from my duties aboard ship and sent back home to Jamestown.
Okay, thank you very much. And now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Roland Kidder, a veteran of the United States Navy in Vietnam.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with these distinguished veterans and to see all of you. And I was specifically asked to talk to you a little bit about the impact of combat on people who go to war. And if you look in your program, you'll see a reference to PFC Dwyer. And PTSD was not a name that was known during the Vietnam War. We had men and veterans who had nightmares, maybe had bad dreams when they came home, but we didn't have a name for it. I think the same was true of the Second World War and other conflicts, but we do now know more about it. And I wanted to just say that my own view, I guess, on this is that people react differently to this experience. I had some bad experiences, and I've never had bad dreams or had any major problems with it. However, human beings are human beings, and war is a total breakdown of civilized society, and when you go out there and start shooting at each other, it can have negative impacts. And I just wanted to relate the stories of three. I did a book 20 years ago on the Second World War, the veterans of the Second World War. And there's three people that I thought I would just briefly mention, and some of you out there would have known these individuals perhaps. One person was gravely affected by his experience, Ralph Pearson. He was a B-24 pilot, and his plane was shot down over Kassel, Germany. And as I put his story in the book, and he got angry with me because he said, "You didn't tell the whole story." And I said, "Ralph, you didn't want me to tell this part of the story." Well, come to find out, he did want me to tell it, so the second edition of the book had it in. But as the plane was burning and he was the pilot, he was supposed to be the last person out of the plane. And he turned to go to the bomb bay to jump out, parachute out, the plane was burning, and there was one of his men was cowered behind the seat, the pilot's seat. And Ralph always felt he never got that person out of that airplane. And he came home, he had drinking problems, he had problems relating to other people, family issues, and it never went away. Finally, when I printed it in the book, he called me up to thank me, though, and he sort of got it off of his chest, I think. But here's a person who I think war greatly affected. On the other hand, some of you have known Fred Johansen, who was a very active person in the community here, and Fred parachuted both into France and into Norway during the Second World War, saw a lot of action, and Fred never mentioned to me that it affected him much at all. He came home after the war, and it didn't really, I don't think to my knowledge, he did not have a dramatic effect on his life, and he was a wonderful person, and those of you who knew Fred, I'm sure would vouch for that. Finally, I think you can be exposed to these kind of things, and it can be a bad experience, but it can end up having a good result. Not always, but sometimes. And the person I thought of there, and some of you may have known Carl Lenz. I was singing in the Presbyterian church choir at the time, and I go to choir, and Carl always had a B-29 tie tack with his tie. And the B-29 was a bomber that was used by the Americans in the Second World War. It could fly 1,500 miles each way, could carry tons of bombs. And it was used, the B-29, to bring Japan to its knees during the war. He was 18 years old. He was a waist gunner. And he came home from the war, and he said, "I couldn't sleep." He said, "I went to college," and he said, I kept wake up in the middle of the night, and I was thinking I was in that plane, and I could hear the drone of the engines, and I could smell the smells. They would go down to 12,000 feet, which was pretty low for a B-29. They could go to 30,000 feet. It was the first pressurized bomber that we ever made. And it could go to high altitudes. But at 12,000 feet, they were more accurate in their bombing, and they were firebombing cities. And he says, "I remember the night I was over Sendai, Japan, and our orders were to drop bombs in the part of the city that still wasn't yet burning." And he said, "I could smell everything. Garbage, people, wood. He said, and the bouncing of the airplane was just almost brought us down, the heat currents. Carl came home, he couldn't sleep. Went to a Christian retreat down in Pittsburgh while he was in college, and he doesn't remember exactly what was said, but there was a scripture from the book of Romans about giving your body a living sacrifice wholly acceptable to God. So he said, I'm going to do that. He didn't know what he was going to do. He started to sleep. He ended up becoming a Presbyterian minister, wearing a tie tack after he retired when he sang in the church choir. So yes, being a veteran can have impacts. I would just leave you one final word, but Carl Lenz, when I went to interview him up at Chautauqua, it was a wintry day, and this experience never dulled Carl's love for flying. He would go to reunions of the 20th Air Force. He loved to get up in airplanes whenever he could. And on his wall was a poem, and it was written by a 19-year-old Royal Canadian Air Force Spitfire pilot in England. And this gentleman was killed when he was 19 years old, but before he died, he was in a training accident. He'd seen combat, but he died actually in a training accident. But anyways, the poem, I'm just going to leave you with it, because here's somebody that was exposed to war who didn't make it, and yet think of the positives. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, he's flying his Spitfire, and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence, hovering there. I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark nor even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful words. Next, we're going to transition to the military experience. And since we have a panel of people from several eras, I'm kind of trying to pull out what was day-to-day life like during the era you served in, whether it was life on a ship or you lived in a barracks. What did you eat on a daily basis? And what was it like to communicate from back home? I was in the service for 20 years and actually kind of went through a transition where it went from letters and occasional phone calls to where you could video Skype somebody on the other side of the world. So describe a little bit your day-to-day life and what it was like to communicate back home. Ms. Garcia?
Day-to-day life was pretty much like it is now. I lived in the dorms for a while, and then I lived in base housing. And after my daughter was born, my mom and stepdad had got a little cassette, micro cassette player, and we each got one. And then we would talk into the micro cassette player and send the tape back through the mail, so at least we could talk back and forth, because we didn't have computers then. We didn't have cell phones then. It was back in probably 83, 82, 83, and so we didn't have computers at that time. And you know, you wrote letters back and forth, but it was nice to get the micro tape, because then you could at least hear their voices. Because when I was in England, it was very expensive to call. It was very expensive to call home. But other than that, you had the same things you have now. You had your house, and you mowed your lawn, and you took care of your kids, and you went to work Monday through Friday, or unless you had a second shift or a third shift or whatever. But and then if you had exercises, you worked your 12-hour shifts, and 12 on and 12 off, and that could go on for weeks or days or whatever. And so it was pretty much, the dorms were kind of different. I mean, everybody was single in the dorms, and nobody had any responsibilities except to get up and go to work, so that was kind of different. I guess it was like, I never went to college, so I guess it would be like a college dorm. 2 to a room, sometimes 1 to a room. When I was stationed in Greece, we would go down to the village, down the closest village, and we would meet people from all over the world because they were down there too. They were vacationing down in the island of Crete. And so it was a lot of fun. And then after I'd gotten married and had my daughter, then it was just like a regular home life. So, but I did really cherish those micro tapes because we did get to at least talk to each other without having to pay for the phone call.
Okay, thank you. Corey?
When I was in, I was in an infantry battalion. It was a little different back then. It's not like that now. People actually all have their own rooms, but we were in, not an open bay, but we had, floors. There was a platoon on each end, and there was about 2 to 3 of us to a room. One of the significant challenges with that is the sergeants would also sleep in the same area. So we did all the cleaning, and we were constantly harassed by them because that's what they did back then, to make us harder and to make sure that we knew that we had to do what they say. But, and the big thing, communication, in peacetime back home was by phone. But there were times, when I could only send a letter. I was in 2 different conflicts. I was in Somalia in 1993 with the Rangers, and there was just a couple of letters that we sent back and forth. I wasn't there very long, but in the more modern era, I led soldiers in Afghanistan, and with the new technologies we have today, I see Skype is on this list. I wouldn't do Skype, maybe because I just didn't take any time. I was too busy writing combat operations and things like that, but some of my soldiers did, and we were in a particularly busy section of Afghanistan. And what that means is the amount of significant acts or contact we made during several months was on a daily basis. And I had one soldier who, 3 separate occasions, we were under a rocket attack when he was talking to his mom face-to-face on Skype. And I told him, I said, listen, you guys can't do that. I was just thinking about his mother. I was in charge of this guy. I'm like, you're going to give your mom a heart attack, because the second these rockets come in, you hear them, and then the alarms all go off, and it's like, so I wasn't real happy about the technology, because, that's not something, honestly, as a leader I wanted to deal with. So it had some serious, technology has some serious drawbacks in a combat zone now for security, and people, communicating classified things, and just like the instance I told you. But yeah, that's pretty much what it was like.
And thanks for sharing that experience. And I'm one of your contemporaries, so I served in Iraq and Afghanistan during the same time, and that was one of the things that's so different, I think, now than the World War II, Korea. Vietnam, you started having a lot more news media coverage, and you had a lot closer up picture of what the war was like. But it's very strange when you're in a deployed location and you have so much access to what's going on back home, because the 2 worlds are so different. And it's an extremely challenging thing sometimes to separate the 2 because they become so intertwined. So I definitely experienced the same thing. Yuri, how about you?
I spent most of my time, probably 90% of my time, deployed. And if I got to sleep on a cot, I thought I was in heaven. As far as food, if anyone's ever eaten a C ration or a K ration, you know what I had to eat. And I became a gourmet chef because I learned how to make anything taste good. As far as communication home, I wrote letters. The craziest time when you're deployed is mail call. people get a little nuts at mail call. Oh, I got a letter from home. Let's see what it is. My family didn't communicate a whole lot with me because I was being rebellious and I joined the military. They didn't want that. But I did have some communication. I didn't get a Dear John letter because there was not a girl back home. I made it through those times. Some of them were really hard times, but they helped me appreciate what I have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And how about you, Lynn?
Well, my life in basic training is, everybody knows pretty much about that, but my life in Korea, I was with the 51st Signal Battalion, and we were a first echelon battalion, and we furnished the communications for I-Corps. And I-Corps, when they had whoever was on the line, we had 4 men, like was the 1st Marines, the British, we called them Fort George. We had 4 men with them. The Rock Division, and then some other groups that was always on the line, and they were changing. We always had 4 men with them. And our living conditions, when I first went there, we were on the move quite a bit. Now, see, when the first day I went there, I got as far as Yongdong-po, and then we went back as far as Suwon. And in Suwon, we was there for, I don't know, about a week, and we went back up to Yongdong-po, and we had to wait for the pontoon bridge to go across the Han River to get our equipment across. And some of our fellows were still with the infantry groups. And so my daily assignments, you never knew just exactly where you would be. If there was trouble over in the 1st Marines with one of our vehicles or something needed be, why, that's where I would be. Or if it was over with Fort George with the British, I've spent nights with the British over there. That's a very interesting thing. Spend a night in one of their bunkers. Our food, why, when we were in the company area, we had what you call a mess tent. It would be just a tent, and they'd have these gasoline-fired stoves. And if you ever had green powdered eggs in the morning, it's wonderful, but there was a little better maybe than sea rations. We did have our sea rations, and on my dog chain I had my little can opener. Without that, you didn't eat sometimes. And that was it. And we furnished the communications. A lot of you people have watched MASH and watched radar trying to get communications through on the telephone. That was our telephone. I was in telephone. I was in T&T Company. R&N Company was right next to us, and they were a radio and message center. And they didn't, and they would set up on the lines and communicate with your B-51s and call in the artillery strikes. And those guys were #1 on the hit list. And it sounds with all your technology that you have today and everything today, our backup message was what? We had one of the R&M guys had a Jeep with a pigeon coop on the back, and they sent pigeons out. That was our backup. And so that was about my daily life. We lived in a tent at times. Now, like when I was with Fort George, I stayed with them in a bunker. And if you'd ever stayed in a frontline bunker, why, it's something a little different. So that was more or less my experiences living there. And communications, why, we had no communications like radio or anything. We had no radio in our company. We just got our communications, and what was going on was word of mouth. But we was in intelligence, so I knew pretty well what was happening with the war there. But from home, it was all done by mail. And that was one of the things that we were a pretty tight-knit group in my group, and we used to share our mail. That was our entertainment a little bit. So that was pretty much my life.
when you were in Korea and you would get mail from home,
Yes.
how far after the mail was actually, the letter was written and produced to the time it got into your hands?
Well, it depended where we were and how bad we was being pushed. If we was in a retreat or so, it might be 3-4 months, because we'd moved around and this and that, and then sometimes it would get back to normal. It would be about a month before mail would get through to us.
Wow, thank you very much. How about you, Paul?
Well, I enlisted in the Navy because, to me, the Navy was an adventure. You're always out to sea most of the time, and the sea is a real challenge, and it gets pretty exciting and it gets pretty scary sometimes. At one time when we were off the coast of North Carolina, Cape Hatteras, we run into rough seas where the waves were, we had 50-foot seas, and everybody was pretty seasick, including one of the men that been in the Navy longer than I was, and he was vomiting over the side, and I figured if he can do it, I can do it. But one time we'd be down into the trough, and you look up on both sides of you, and there's a wall of water. And the top one is coming down to replace the lower one. Now you're up 50 feet in the air looking down at the water. So that's part of Navy life and the challenge in the Navy. And my job was the leading chief signalman on the bridge. I had 10 men in my division, and most of the time aboard ship was standing watch. We stood 4 on and 8 off. And during combat, we'd stand 4 on and 4 off. And life aboard ship was unique in that you're confined to your ship and your sleeping quarters, your living quarters. And there's not too many things that you can do outside of writing a letter now and then back home. And if you wrote the right things, it got to your parents. If they wrote the wrong things, you got to them with half of your letter torn up because it was censored. And food aboard ship was always good, and that was another reason why I enjoyed the Navy. You always had a hot meal. You had showers. You had clean living quarters, and it was exciting every day to get up and find out you're into a new day. And one of the other reasons one of the things that happened when I enlisted was the recruiter said to me, he says, you picked a good branch of service to get into, he says, and when you're a Navy man, he says, you get to eat 6 meals a day. He says, when you're out at sea, you get 6 meals a day. 3 go down and 3 come up. So, so those things do happen, but I got seasick only twice during my 3 years in the Navy, and I felt pretty good about getting past the seasickness. And during the invasion, it was always exciting because you were always on the lookout for things that you don't really expect to happen to you. And of course, when we emptied off our ship, we always got the wounded coming aboard ship, and we had doctors that would take care of them. And until we got to England, then they would be taken off and put to the hospital. And being the leading chief signalman on the bridge, I didn't have too many details to do because of my rate. And most of the work aboard ship was swabbing decks and writing letters home or just chatting with your fellow shipmates. And that was life aboard ship.
Thank you very much. One of the things I find very interesting, and I think it's being highlighted today by talking to veterans who served during all eras, is how different the day-to-day life was. I think of my experience and my contemporaries' experience where your day-to-day life, for the most part, is no different than it would be as a civilian. You go to work, you typically have private living quarters, your family may be with you, and you do all the things that you would do as a civilian, but then at the same time you deploy and you experience a lot of the same harsh living conditions, uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, all the things that go with being in a combat zone, because today's force is more of a career force as opposed to older eras where you would build up a large number of young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines for the purpose of the war, and everyone's focus was the war effort. And then after that short time, they would separate from the military and come home. Today, 55% of our force is beyond their first enlistment. So, greater than 50% have made a career of the military, and it makes for a much different experience from World War II up to the modern era. We're getting close to the highlight of the show, which is the welcome home part. And this is where we get to describe a little bit what homecoming was like. Now, it's going to be a little bit different for everyone. I'm going to tell a personal story, a good story. For myself, I had the opportunity to deploy 6 times during my 20-year career, and each one was a little bit different. So my homecoming after retiring from the service wasn't particularly memorable because it was kind of day-to-day life. I just moved my family and my house here back to Chautauqua County and moved on. But coming home from a deployed location was significant because you don't realize how blessed we are to live in this country with all of the things that we have until you've had that taken away from you for a little while. And I try not to get emotional about things, but one particular deployment, I was taking a government contracted aircraft home. I believe it was after an Iraq deployment, and we were flying over the ocean what seemed like forever, and it was nighttime. And the contract aircraft was from a European company, so the significance of this is it wasn't even an American flight crew, but as we're flying over, it's night, and you could see the lights from the coast. And the pilots pointed it out. They said, hey, if you look off to your left, you can see the coast. And then simultaneously over the PA, they played America the Beautiful. And I remember just being overcome with emotion right at that moment, where that's not something that I would normally think that would play into, but that's a homecoming experience. I remember, I'll never forget, and I think one of the things that the military did for me, or how the experience affected me, was to have that feeling, to have something taken away from you, and then the feeling you get when you're reunited with a place that you love so much. So that was one of my homecoming experiences. Now, to the panel, I asked the same question: what was your homecoming like? Whether that was homecoming from the service or homecoming from a deployment, if that's a more fitting story. And what was the reception like, or what was the world, the political and cultural climate at the time that you returned? For me, it was amazing because in today's world, the troops are overwhelmingly supported, and it may not have been that case for everyone. So we'll start with you again, Ms. Garcia.
It wasn't very climatic. I just came home. I mean, I retired and then I came home. It wasn't.
And how did so having been through the military, and you retired from the military, having been through basic training and served overseas, and how has that influenced you now, your time in the service? How has that affected you?
It's kind of hard because you were always told what to do, where to go, how to dress, what time to be there, and then you get out and it's like there's no one to tell you. And so it's difficult. It's hard to adjust. And you've had that for so long, and then it's still hard. It's still hard. Especially if you have problems, then it's even harder still, so.
Thank you. Corey?
I, like Greg, was also, contemporary now. There's a lot of support for us. I've come back when I came back from Somalia, that was a conflict, that wasn't a war. So when we got off the plane, there was a bunch of generals there, shook our hands, gave us a coin, and we got trucked back to our barracks and waited for the next mission. I mean, that's really what it was like for that. But I did have the opportunity to deploy to Afghanistan with a platoon of infantrymen, and I was in the National Guard. I was a full-time National Guard person, but just, nowadays the National Guard, the people in the National Guard have deployed 6 times during this 14, 15-year conflict. But when we came back, I know I was very happy to be back. All of us were, because it was pretty stressful where we were. But I'll never forget when we landed at the airport, at a Bradley International Airport in Hartford, Connecticut. There were 2 engine trucks from a fire company that were hose and ladder trucks shooting red, white, and blue water over the plane when we came in. I mean, it was something I'll never forget. And the support was, and we got off the plane. We had to stand in formation. That was another one of the hardest things I ever had to do. I had to form my guys up while their family was there. They hadn't seen in a year, didn't even know if they were going to see him again. And once we got up there and the first sergeant let him go, I mean, that was it. There were senators, congressmen. The governor was always there thanking us. But again, we went about our day-to-day duties, and the significant thing I'd like to bring up that's important is the services now for veterans are just off the charts. I mean, if I tell the veterans that I work with, because I'm like a peer, because I led them in war, so they still look to me for answers, for help, for things like that. And I told them, you guys got to advocate for yourself, because there's everything out there. There is someone willing to help you with everything. So that was, that's one of the things I just want to mention as the most fortunate thing that I felt, and the most significant thing to coming home now is the support from the country and from the citizens of that country.
Thank you. Now, Yuri's going to have the floor here, but I want to say something about our Vietnam veterans, because their experience was obviously much different than that of my contemporaries who were overwhelmingly supported. If you've heard me speak before about Vietnam veterans, you've heard this line before, but there's a country song that says, "I was country when country wasn't cool." Vietnam veterans were patriots when being a patriot wasn't cool. And their welcome home wasn't the same as a lot of our welcome home. And as a veteran advocate, any chance I get to help a Vietnam veteran and try to heal some of the wounds of that time in American history, because civilian control of our military is a principle, and these guys served their country, and it wasn't up to them to go or not to go. That was decisions that were not made by them. They served their country honorably and faithfully, and I look forward to Yuri's contrasting experience of Vietnam.
Thank you. Coming home for me was a very, very traumatic experience. I came home to shouts of "baby killer." That was some of the nice things they said about us. There was nothing really nice about coming home, except it was a comfortable ride on the Greyhound bus. I went to college right after coming home. Any other students at college had no idea what it was like to be in combat. College professors had no idea what it was like to have served in combat. Other students looked at me with hate and disgust and disdain. And one incident I shared. One morning I woke up, my college dorm room, I came out the door, and attached to the front door of my dorm room was a doll with a knife stuck through it, hanging by a noose, and written in red paint on my dorm room was "baby killer." And the questions that people asked me was, how many kids did you kill in Vietnam? Why did you go over there and abuse those poor Vietnamese people? I put up with this for about 4 years. Decided I'd had enough, and I left this country. Went home to Israel, where I'm from originally. Joined the army there. I spent the next 30 years in the Israeli army. And of all places, they sent me back to the United States to work because I speak English without an Israeli accent. Thanks to groups like the Dwyer Group, I'm getting through. I'm handling things. It's been many years since the Vietnam War, but the stigma is still there. And I thank everybody who supports us now. I thank everybody who supports patriotism and who supports our U.S. servicemen. On a lighter note, my colleague over here who was in the Navy reminded me of something that we used to say, GI beans and GI gravy. Gee, I wish I'd joined the Navy. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. And Lynn, if you talk a little bit about your homecoming from Korea.
Well, my homecoming really wasn't, no whistles blowing, no flags, no marches, no nothing. It was very silent and quiet. My fondest memory of myself is when our ship that I was on went underneath the Golden Gate. That was, brought a lot back to me. And then I went to Stoneman, and they put us on a plane to go to Indiantown Gap. Well, the plane was a privately owned company that had contracted to the government to transport troops at that time. And the plane was in kind of bad shape, and it started leaking oil very bad. Well, we got from Stoneman to Needles. We had to sit down in an oil tank truck, had to come out and fill it up. We got from there over to Phoenix and then back up to Oklahoma City. It was 18 hours. I can't remember all the places we had to put down to get oil. And And then it landed in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the oil was running right out of the bottom of it. And of course, all my baggage and everything I had that had been issued in Stallman, all my clothing was oil soaked, so that was nothing. And so we was bussed over to Indiantown Gap, and I spent about a week there being processed, and was released from Indiantown Gap to come home, and that was it. It was just a ticket to go out and walk out the gate and hire a cab or whatever you wanted to do to get a bus or however you wanted to get home. Well, I got into Buffalo, it was about 3 a.m. in the morning, and then I had to wait to get on in the Dunkard and called up a family member. But at that time, we weren't even recognized really as veterans because Korea wasn't declared an actual war. I don't remember exactly the time that was declared a war. So there was no recognition to us at all. It was a peace action. And our saying over there, war is hell and peace action is worse. Then I continued my life, but I did have some experiences of it. You'd get a flashback. My last flashback was in the 70s in Dunkard. I was in Dunkard. They was making a film of Toby Helicki, and they was doing a film there, and they was blowing up cars and stuff, and a bank robbery, and I was standing there, and I was along the side of the building there on the corner of Central and 4th Street. And these police cars were going down through there, and this special vehicle they had was going to blow them up. But when that went off, I didn't see a vehicle being blown up. I saw an Army truck with GIs coming out of it. And I said, take me home now. So that was my experiences on my homecoming.
Well, thank you very much for sharing. And Paul, homecoming for you.
Well, I'll give you a short answer. And it was not exciting at all coming home, only except for the part of meeting up with my family again, my mom, dad, and my brothers, and getting back to normal life again. And I tried finding some of my old friends that I grew up with, but they were either in service or elsewhere, and so meeting up with some of my old friends was almost impossible. So I met up with a girl, and after a period of a year or two, we got married, and I raised a family and raised twin daughters and a son. And that was my homecoming.
Oh, thank you. Well, we've run a little bit over our time, but I thank all of you for joining us today, and I especially want to thank this panel and thank Mr. Kidder for coming out. It's very difficult sometimes to speak about your experiences, especially in front of a group of people, and we appreciate their courage in doing so and their insight on their experiences and their homecoming. And if we could give them a round of applause, that would be wonderful.
We just want to thank all of you. We appreciate you coming and sharing a little bit of your stories. Thank you for what you've done for our country. We have a little gift for you that we'll give you on the way downstairs, and we appreciate everyone coming to support them. If you'd like to go downstairs and join us for the luncheon, and Rodney will continue the discussion about what it looks like to be a veteran as well as what it looks like to do exactly what they're doing here today and to serve each day in America and to make a difference and give back. And we just appreciate you giving back a little bit of your story. So we welcome everyone to join us downstairs, and we'll give out the gifts as you all head downstairs. Thank you.